Imagine being so hungry that your body starts consuming itself. Your vision blurs. Your hands shake uncontrollably. Every thought becomes about food, water, anything to end the agony. Now imagine the people you've been told are monsters are the ones who save you. This is the true story of Japanese women prisoners of war who went 7 days without food, and how their American captors showed them humanity when they expected only death. August 1945. The war in the Pacific was ending, but for dozens of Japanese women held in a makeshift detention facility on Okinawa, the nightmare was just beginning. These weren't soldiers. They were nurses, teachers, clerks, and civilians caught in the final desperate months of a collapsing empire. Keiko Yamada had been a schoolteacher in Naha before the invasion. Michiko Tanaka was a nurse who stayed behind to treat the wounded. 19-year-old Hanasato had barely lived any life at all before war consumed everything she knew. Together with dozens of other women, they found themselves imprisoned in a converted warehouse, surrounded by barbed wire and uncertainty. The Japanese military had told them stories about American soldiers. Brutal stories. Horrifying stories. Stories designed to make civilians choose death over capture. As the women watched their captors through the wire fence, they expected those stories to come true at any moment. Instead, something else happened. Nothing. For days, nothing happened at all. No food arrived. No water came. The guards, overwhelmed and undersupplied in the chaos of war's end, seemed to forget they existed. Or perhaps they simply had nothing to give. The reasons didn't matter to empty stomachs. Day 1 without food felt manageable. Keiko remembered the rationing during the war years. Hunger was an old companion. She gathered the younger women around her, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy, some structure to keep panic at bay. They organized themselves into groups, shared what little water they could collect from rain, and told each other that food would come tomorrow. Michiko, the nurse, checked on the weakest among them, knowing her medical knowledge but having no supplies to act on it. She could diagnose their deteriorating condition with precision, but she couldn't stop it. That helplessness ate at her more than the hunger. Day 2 brought weakness. The chatter among the women decreased. Energy became too precious to waste on words. Hana, the youngest, began to cry softly in the corner. Mrs. Fumiko Ito, an older woman who had survived decades of hardship, held the girl close and whispered stories from her childhood, anything to distract from the growing emptiness. The other women lay on the bare concrete floor trying to conserve their strength. Some prayed to ancestors. Some prayed to gods. Some had stopped praying altogether. Day 3 was when the body begins to truly rebel. Headaches became constant companions. Dizziness made standing difficult. The women's movements became slow, deliberate, calculated to use the minimum energy. Michiko recognized the signs of acute starvation setting in. The body, denied external fuel, begins consuming its own muscle tissue. The brain, demanding glucose, starts pulling from every available resource. She kept this knowledge to herself. What good would medical facts do when there was no treatment? When there was no food? Keiko watched the guards beyond the fence eating their rations. The smell of cooking rice drifted across the compound like torture. She wasn't angry. Anger required energy she didn't have. She simply watched with hollow eyes, wondering if this was how her story would end. Not in bombing raids, not in battle, but slowly fading away in a forgotten warehouse while the world moved on without her. Day 4 brought hallucinations to some of the weaker women. They spoke to people who weren't there. They reached for food that didn't exist. Michiko tried to keep them hydrated with rainwater, but water without nutrients only prolonged the agony. The human body can survive weeks without food under ideal conditions, but these conditions were far from ideal. The stress, the heat, the psychological trauma, all accelerated the decline. Hana had stopped crying. She didn't have the moisture left for tears. She lay with her head in Mrs. Ito's lap, staring at nothing, retreating somewhere inside herself where hunger couldn't follow. Day 5 was when the first woman collapsed completely. She didn't die, not yet, but she stopped responding, stopped moving. Her body had entered a state of extreme conservation, shutting down all non-essential functions. Michiko sat beside her, holding her hand, feeling the weak pulse, knowing she was losing her, knowing she might lose all of them. The other women watched in silence. Each collapse was a preview of their own fate. each labored breath a countdown to their own final moments. Outside the fence, the war had officially ended. Surrender documents had been signed. Victory celebrations had begun. But inside the warehouse, the war continued in the form of slow starvation. The women didn't know about the surrender. They didn't know about the peace. They only knew hunger, thirst, and the growing certainty that they had been forgotten, left to die not from violence but from neglect. Day 6 brought acceptance. Most of the women had stopped talking entirely. They lay where they were, too weak to move, too depleted to care. Keiko thought about her students, wondered if any of them had survived. She thought about her parents dead in the firebombing of Tokyo. She thought about the life she'd planned to live, the person she'd hoped to become. All of it felt very far away now, like a dream from someone else's life. Her vision had narrowed to a tunnel. Her hearing had become muffled. Her body was shutting down, piece by piece, system by system. Michiko knew what Day 7 would bring. The human body has limits, and they had reached theirs. Without food, without medical care, without intervention, morning would find several of them dead. The rest would follow within hours. She looked at the faces around her. Young Hana, barely more than a child. Mrs. Ito, who had survived so much only to end here. Keiko, who had tried so hard to keep everyone's spirits alive. Michiko had spent her life healing people, and now she would watch them die, helpless to prevent it. The cruelty of that felt worse than the hunger. Day 7 dawned like the previous 6, hot and merciless. Keiko didn't think she would see another sunset. She had accepted this. She closed her eyes, ready for whatever came next. Then she heard voices. American voices. The warehouse door opened for the first time in a week and light flooded in. Keiko couldn't lift her head, but she heard boots on concrete, heard exclamations of shock in English. She heard one voice rise above the others. Young, horrified, urgent. Sergeant Robert Mitchell had been a soldier for 2 years. He'd seen combat, seen death, seen the worst that war could produce. But nothing had prepared him for what he found in that warehouse. Dozens of women, skeletal, barely alive, lying in their own waste because they were too weak to move. The smell hit him first, then the sight. His stomach lurched. These weren't enemy combatants. These were starving civilians who had been forgotten. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't process what he was seeing. Then his training kicked in. Water. They needed water, food, medical care. They needed help, and they needed it immediately. He ran back outside, shouting for medics, for supplies, for anyone who could help. Captain William Thompson arrived within minutes, took one look inside, and began barking orders. Every available resource was to be diverted here, immediately. Corporal James Henderson, the unit's cook, was pulled from his duties and told to prepare food for emergency feeding. Not regular rations. These women were too far gone for that. They needed carefully prepared meals, easily digestible, nutrients without overwhelming their shrunken stomachs. Henderson, a cook from Nebraska who'd fed thousands of soldiers, suddenly faced the most important meal he would ever prepare. Inside the warehouse, medics moved among the women with water and wet cloths. Sergeant Mitchell knelt beside Keiko. She opened her eyes, saw the American uniform, and waited for whatever would come. Death, torture, the fulfillment of all the propaganda she'd been fed. Instead, Mitchell gently lifted her head and brought a canteen to her lips. Water. Cool, clean water. She drank slowly, carefully, afraid it was a hallucination. But the water was real. The hand supporting her head was real. The concerned face above her was real. Tears began to fall. Not from Keiko at first. She was too dehydrated for tears. But from Mitchell, this hardened combat veteran who had shot enemy soldiers and watched friends die, found tears running down his face as he helped this dying woman drink. He didn't speak Japanese. She didn't speak English. But some communications transcend language. His gentle touch said everything. You're safe now. We're here to help. You're going to survive. Michiko, the nurse, watched this scene from where she lay. She saw American soldiers treating her fellow prisoners with tenderness, with humanity. She saw everything she'd been told about these men revealed as lies. They weren't monsters. They were young men, many barely older than Hana, shocked by suffering and moved to compassion. When a medic reached Michiko, she managed to whisper that she was a nurse. The medic's eyes widened with respect. He began asking her questions. using hand gestures and simple words. Who was worst? Who needed immediate intervention? Michiko directed him with hand gestures, conserving her energy, helping even now. Hana felt herself being lifted. Strong arms carried her outside into the sunlight. She blinked against the brightness, confused, afraid. Then she was set down gently on a clean blanket. A medical corpsman began checking her vital signs, his touch professional but kind. He looked at her with such sadness, such anger at what had been allowed to happen. He called for an IV, for emergency hydration. Hana didn't understand his words, but she understood his tone. Someone cared whether she lived or died. After a week of abandonment, someone cared. Corporal Henderson worked faster than he'd ever worked in his life. He prepared rice porridge, thin and bland but perfect for starved stomachs. He made weak broth from vegetables, loaded with electrolytes. He mixed powdered milk with water, creating a nutrient-rich liquid that wouldn't shock their systems. Every dish was designed for one purpose, to restore life to dying bodies without causing harm. In the kitchen tent, Henderson prayed while he cooked. He wasn't a religious man, but he prayed anyway. Prayed that his food would heal. Prayed that he wasn't too late. The first servings came out within the hour. Small portions, carefully measured. The women were gathered in a shaded area, lying on clean blankets receiving IV fluids. When Henderson and his assistants arrived with the food, silence fell. The women stared at the bowls being distributed. After 7 days of nothing, after resigning themselves to death, food had arrived. Not scraps, not rotten rations, but hot, carefully prepared meals. Keiko took her bowl with shaking hands. She looked at the American soldier who handed it to her, searching his face for cruelty, for mockery. She found only concern. She lifted the spoon to her lips. The rice porridge was warm, slightly sweet, perfect. The first bite hit her empty stomach like a miracle. The taste exploded across her tongue, sensation she'd forgotten could exist. She took another small bite, then another. Beside her, other women were eating too, slowly, carefully. Some were crying, some were laughing, some were doing both simultaneously. The emotional dam broke all at once. These women who had expected death, who had been taught to fear their captors, were being fed by those same captors with more care than their own military had shown. Michiko ate her porridge with tears streaming down her face. She wasn't crying from sadness or fear. She was crying from the sudden, overwhelming reversal of everything she thought she knew. The enemy was feeding her. The monsters were saving her life. Every bite contradicted years of propaganda. Every gentle word from the American medic shattered another lie she'd been told. She looked around at her fellow prisoners, saw the same realization dawning on face after face. We were lied to. About everything. Young Hana couldn't stop shaking as she ate. The food was too much, too good, too unexpected. Mrs. Ito, sitting beside her, wrapped an arm around the girl's shoulders and held her while they both ate. The elderly woman had lived through the Russo-Japanese War, through the Great Kanto earthquake, through decades of hardship. She thought nothing could surprise her anymore. But this act of enemy compassion, this shocked her to her core. She caught the eye of Corporal Henderson, who was watching anxiously to ensure the women could tolerate the food. She bowed her head to him, as deeply as her weakened state allowed. He returned the bow, awkward, but sincere. Sergeant Mitchell watched the women eat, watched them cry, watched them slowly come back to life. He thought about the propaganda he'd seen, the images of Japanese cruelty, the stories of atrocities. All of it might be true. War brought out the worst in humanity. But looking at these starving women, these teachers and nurses and civilians, he saw no enemy. He saw victims of the same war that had scarred him. He saw people who deserved kindness regardless of which flag they'd been born under. He made a decision then. He would ensure they received the best care available, not because orders demanded it, but because it was right. Over the following hours, the women's condition stabilized. The food and fluids began to work their magic. Color returned to gray faces. Eyes that had been dull and lifeless began to focus again. Conversation, impossible for days, resumed in whispers and quiet words. The American medical team worked tirelessly, checking vitals, administering care, ensuring no one was overfed too quickly. Captain Thompson arranged for better facilities, for more supplies, for everything these women would need to fully recover. The forgotten prisoners had been found, and they would not be abandoned again. As evening fell on day 7, Keiko sat up for the first time without assistance. Her body still ached, her muscles still screamed from starvation, but she was alive. They were all alive. She looked across the camp at Sergeant Mitchell, who was helping distribute dinner, another small, carefully prepared meal. She caught his eye and smiled. It was a small smile, weak, but genuine. Mitchell smiled back. No words passed between them. None were needed. In that moment, in that smile, was acknowledgement of shared humanity, of choosing compassion over hate, of finding light in the darkest circumstances. Michiko, true to her nature as a healer, began helping the American medics care for the other women. Despite her own weakness, she moved among them, translating where she could, offering comfort, using her medical knowledge to assist. The American medics welcomed her help gratefully. They worked side by side, former enemies united in the common cause of preserving life. Michiko thought about her training, about the oath she'd taken as a nurse, to heal, to comfort, to ease suffering. War had made her forget that oath sometimes. These Americans had reminded her why she'd taken it in the first place. Hana slept that night for the first time in a week without the gnawing pain of starvation. She dreamed of food, of home, of a future she'd thought was lost. When she woke in the darkness, momentarily disoriented, she heard the quiet sounds of other women breathing, living. She heard American guards on patrol, not to threaten, but to protect. She realized with sudden clarity that she would survive this. She would go home. She would have a life beyond this warehouse, beyond this war. The thought made her cry again, but these were good tears, grateful tears, tears of relief so profound it hurt. Mrs. Ito lay awake, watching the stars through the open door. An American guard stood silhouette against the night, keeping watch. She thought about all she'd seen in her long life. War and peace, cruelty and kindness, the best and worst of humanity. Tonight she'd witnessed something that would stay with her forever. The moment when enemies chose to be human first. The moment when compassion defeated hatred. She closed her eyes, whispered thanks to ancestors and gods alike, and allowed herself to hope for the future again. The next days brought continued recovery. The women grew stronger. Meals became more substantial as their bodies adjusted. American doctors examined everyone, treating infections, addressing malnutrition, ensuring no one suffered lasting damage from the starvation. Communication barriers slowly broke down. Simple words were learned. Japanese women taught Americans basic phrases. Americans taught Japanese women simple English. Laughter, impossible to imagine just days before, began to emerge. The human spirit, given the slightest chance, begins to heal. Keiko started teaching English to some of the younger women. It gave her purpose, reminded her of who she was beyond a prisoner, beyond a victim. She taught them useful phrases. Thank you, please, help, friend. That last word felt important. Friend. She practiced saying it to Sergeant Mitchell. He grinned and repeated it back in broken Japanese, Tomodachi, friend. It became their greeting. Each morning, he would check on the women, and Keiko would greet him. Friend. Such a simple word, such a profound truth. Michiko worked alongside the American medical staff, learning their techniques, sharing her own knowledge. Medicine became a universal language. A wounded body needed care regardless of nationality. An infection required treatment whether American or Japanese. The American doctor, Captain Morrison, began teaching her about new treatments, new medications developed during the war. Michiko absorbed it all hungrily. Knowledge was survival. Knowledge was hope. Knowledge meant she could save more lives when she finally returned home. Corporal Henderson took particular interest in ensuring the women's meals were not just nutritious, but enjoyable. He experimented with flavors, tried to replicate Japanese dishes with available ingredients, asked Michiko and Mrs. Ito for guidance. The kitchen became a place of cultural exchange. Henderson learned to make decent miso soup. Mrs. Ito learned about American apple pie. Food, the thing whose absence had nearly killed them, became the bridge between cultures, breaking bread together. Humanity's oldest peace treaty. Hana began to smile again. Her youth and resilience helped her recover faster than the older women. She started helping distribute meals, assisting the medics, making herself useful. She needed to do something, anything, to repay the kindness shown to her. One afternoon, she found wildflowers growing near the camp perimeter. She picked them carefully and brought them to the American soldiers on duty, offering them with a shy bow. The soldiers were touched. Several kept the flowers in their helmets. Small gestures, enormous meanings. 3 weeks after their rescue, the women were deemed healthy enough to be processed for repatriation. They would return to Japan, to whatever remained of their homes, to try to rebuild their lives in a defeated nation. The prospect was daunting, but they faced it with strength they hadn't known they possessed. They had survived starvation. They had survived war. They would survive peace, too. On their final evening in the camp, Captain Thompson arranged a farewell gathering. Nothing fancy. Just a meal, some music from a portable radio, a chance to say goodbye. Keiko stood to speak, Michiko translating her Japanese into English. She thanked the Americans for their kindness, for their humanity, for saving lives when they could have simply looked away. She spoke of how they had expected death and received life instead, how they had expected cruelty and received compassion, how they would carry this memory forever, this proof that even in war's darkest hours human decency could prevail. Her words brought tears to hardened soldiers' eyes. These men who had fought across the Pacific, who had seen unimaginable horrors, wept openly at a Japanese woman's gratitude. Sergeant Mitchell responded, his words simple but heartfelt. He said that they had only done what anyone should do, that feeding the hungry, caring for the sick, showing mercy to the helpless, these weren't American values or Japanese values. They were human values. He said that he hoped someday, maybe not soon, but someday there could be real peace between their nations. Not just absence of war, but genuine friendship. He looked at Keiko when he said it, and she nodded. Friend, Tomodachi. It was possible. This small group had proven it was possible. Corporal Henderson brought out a special dessert he'd been saving, canned peaches, a luxury item. He served them himself to each woman, wanting to ensure their last meal in his care was memorable. Mrs. Ito took his hand as he served her, squeezing it gently. No translation needed. Some thanks transcend language. Henderson, tough Nebraska farm boy who'd never cried during 2 years of combat, had to step away to compose himself. These women had broken through every defense he'd built against feeling too much in wartime. Hana gave each American soldier a small origami crane she'd folded from scrap paper. In Japanese tradition, cranes symbolized peace and hope. The soldiers accepted them reverently, treasured these paper birds more than any medal. One soldier asked Hana to teach him to fold one. She did, patiently correcting his clumsy fingers, laughing when his crane looked more like a confused duck. They laughed together. Japanese teenager and American soldier, laughing over origami. War's absurdity had never been more obvious. The next morning, trucks arrived to take the women to the port. They would board ships for home, joining thousands of other displaced Japanese civilians. As they prepared to leave, each woman said personal goodbyes to the Americans who had cared for them. Michiko gave Captain Morrison her nurse's badge, the only possession she'd kept through everything. He tried to refuse, but she insisted. She wanted him to have something to remember her by, to remember that they had been colleagues, not just captor and prisoner. Morrison pinned it to his uniform, above his heart. Keiko and Sergeant Mitchell stood facing each other, an entire war between them, and yet nothing between them at all. Mitchell had written his address on a piece of paper. He gave it to Keiko, telling her through gestures and broken words that if she ever needed help, any help at all, she should write. Keiko accepted it, knowing the odds of ever being able to use it were slim. But the gesture mattered. The offer of continued friendship mattered. She bowed deeply. He bowed back. Then, breaking protocol, breaking every rule of conduct between soldier and former prisoner, they shook hands. Equals. Friends. Mrs. Ito hugged Corporal Henderson, this enormous American cook who had saved their lives with his careful meals. She told him in Japanese that he had the soul of a grandmother, always feeding everyone, always caring. Michiko translated, and Henderson laughed through his tears. Highest compliment he'd ever received, he said. Mrs. Ito pressed something into his hand, a small carved button from her dress, the only item of value she possessed. Henderson would keep it for the rest of his life, would show it to his grandchildren decades later when telling this story. Hana was the last to board the truck. She turned back one final time, looking at the camp where she'd nearly died and then been reborn. She looked at the Americans who had saved her, who had shown her that enemies could become friends, that humanity could survive even war's worst impulses. She raised her hand in a wave. Every American in sight waved back. Then the truck pulled away, carrying the women toward their uncertain futures, carrying them home. The journey took weeks. The women traveled by ship, by train, by foot. Japan was devastated, cities reduced to rubble, people starving, infrastructure destroyed. The women returned to find homes gone, families scattered, lives upended. But they returned alive, which was more than many could say. And they returned with a story, a true story about a week without food and the enemy soldiers who fed them, about expecting death and receiving life, about propaganda lies and human truths. Keiko returned to what remained of Naha. Her school was destroyed, but children still needed education. She began teaching again, this time in a tent, using salvaged materials. She taught English, the language of the occupiers, because she believed in building bridges. She told her students about Sergeant Mitchell, about choosing to see individuals rather than enemies. Some older people criticized her for befriending Americans. She didn't argue. She simply continued teaching, continued building the future one child at a time. Michiko found work at a hospital in Tokyo, treating the countless wounded and sick in a nation struggling to rebuild. She worked alongside American military doctors during the occupation, bridging the gap between Japanese patients and American medicine. She taught Japanese medical students the techniques she'd learned from Captain Morrison. She advocated for humane treatment of patients, remembering how American medics had treated her with dignity. Medicine transcended politics. Healing transcended hatred. Hana eventually became a translator, her exposure to Americans during those crucial weeks giving her a foundation in English. She specialized in helping reunite separated families, facilitating adoptions of war orphans, building connections between former enemies. She married, had children, built a life. She told them about the warehouse, about starvation, about the American soldiers who fed a hungry girl and saved her life. She taught them that people, individual people, could choose kindness even when systems chose cruelty. Mrs. Ito lived another 20 years, seeing Japan transform from defeated nation to economic powerhouse. She saw former enemies become allies, trade partners, friends. She lived to see Sergeant Mitchell's hope realized, genuine peace between their nations. In her final years, sitting with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, she would tell the story of the week without food, how she thought she would die, how Americans saved her, how humanity triumphed, how hope survived. The children would listen, wide-eyed, learning the most important lesson, that even in darkness, there is light. Even in war, there is humanity. Even in hatred, there is the possibility of love. Back in America, Sergeant Robert Mitchell returned to civilian life. He became a teacher, like Keiko. He taught history, but not just dates and battles. He taught about the cost of war, the value of compassion, the importance of seeing humanity in everyone. He kept Keiko's address. He wrote to her once, years later. Amazingly, the letter reached her. She wrote back. They corresponded occasionally over the decades, two teachers on opposite sides of the world, sharing their hopes for a better future. They never met again after that morning at the camp, but they remained friends. Tomodachi, until Mitchell's death in 1989, with Keiko's letters saved in a box marked important. Corporal James Henderson returned to Nebraska, opened a restaurant. He cooked for his community the same way he'd cooked for those starving women, with care, with love, with the understanding that feeding someone is an act of profound humanity. He kept Mrs. Ito's button in his wallet, showed it to anyone who would listen. He told the story constantly, boring his family with repetition, but unable to stop. It was the most important thing he'd ever done. Not the battles, not the medals. Feeding those women, saving those lives. That was what mattered. Captain Thompson retired as a colonel, spent his later years advocating for humanitarian treatment of prisoners of war. He used the warehouse incident as a case study in proper conduct, in moral leadership, in choosing humanity over expedience. He testified before Congress, advised military policy, trained new officers. He carried photographs of the Japanese women before and after their rescue. showing them to skeptical generals and politicians. This is what's at stake, he would say. This is why our conduct matters, not just for them, for us, for who we choose to be. The warehouse where the women nearly died was eventually torn down, the base closed. The war faded into history, but the story survived. It survived in letters, in memories, in official reports. It survived in the lives saved, the children born to women who shouldn't have survived, the ripples extending forward through time. History remembers the great battles, the famous generals, the turning points. But history is also made in small moments, in a sergeant bringing water to a dying woman, in a cook preparing careful meals, in enemies choosing to be friends. This story, this true story, reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, we retain the choice to be human. That compassion is stronger than propaganda, that kindness can survive hatred, that a simple bowl of rice porridge, given with genuine care, can change lives. The women who starved for a week and then were fed by their enemies never forgot. They carried that memory, that proof of human goodness through all their remaining years. And in carrying it, they kept alive a vital truth, that we are more than our nations, more than our uniforms, more than the wars we fight. We are human first. And that humanity, that essential shared nature, can bridge any divide if we let it. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of our shared humanity, please subscribe to this channel for more incredible true stories from history. Hit that like button and leave a comment telling us what you think. What would you have done in that situation? How can we apply these lessons to our world today? Your engagement helps these important stories reach more people. Thank you for watching, and remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about learning how to build a better future.